Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much to Bill and the BES for inviting me to give this talk. So this morning I want to argue for the central and transformative role of systematic reviews in evidence organization. Systematic review being a methodology which up until recently has been almost completely ignored by the environmental sector, although it's been developed quite well in other sectors. And obviously, I want to argue that we need to invest significant resources in this kind of evidence synthesis in order to provide a much better organized evidence base to inform policy. So I'll start by looking at some of the cultural issues surrounding this and some of the challenges that we have in organizing evidence. So we've heard a little bit already about the idea that evidence is everywhere and we're all evidence informed, aren't we? We use it all the time. But in fact, using evidence does not mean our decisions are in any way what we would understand as being evidence-based in the sense of taking into account all of the evidence. What we tend to do is we select the evidence that we want based on our own prior beliefs for all sorts of different reasons. We're selective and we're biased in the way we use evidence, and that goes for individuals and it goes for organizations. And it goes for the scientific community as well in the way we present evidence to the outside world. We present it in little fragments of science that is published in journals and is promoted by the authors and some of the authors' friends. And that, in a sense, is no better than the way in which the anti-science lobby, which is what this cartoon is about, actually provides information. And they do it better. There's good evidence that social media now is being used much better by the anti-science lobby than it is by the scientific community. And for those of us who think that using evidence objectively is a good idea, well, the bad news is we're heavily outnumbered by those who don't think that, and we really have a battle on our hands to win the hearts and minds of the general public that science is actually useful in informing anything that they do or any of the decisions that they make. We need to get organized. The biggest issue then is is counteracting the biased way in which we tend to use evidence, both in the scientific community and outside of it. And there are two basic, there are lots of different biases, but there are two basic sets. One is the simple one of selecting the evidence that is most useful to you and fits with your prior belief. So an example of this is confirmation bias, the tendency to search for and interpret information consistent with one's prior beliefs, the so-called policy-based evidence, which was mentioned by John Beddington last night. The idea that a policymaker will say, well, give me the evidence that supports my policy. And the other one, of course, is within experiments, within the conduct of studies. The study design means that it is more or less susceptible to bias in terms of the findings that it produces. So there are a number of challenges that we have if we want to counteract those biases and provide an organized evidence base that minimizes those biases effectively. So the first two of these challenges are really nice ones to have in a sense. The sheer amount of data that's out there, we've just heard a talk actually that suggests there's very little data for bats, but for a lot of things in the environmental sector, there are huge amounts of data and it's increasing rapidly, and similarly with scientific articles. So the primary evidence, the primary research out there is increasing a lot, and that's a nice problem to have, but it does provide challenges of synthesizing it all. And then there are some less nice challenges. The wide range in the quality and reliability of science, so not all studies are equally valuable to us. Some are better than others, and we need to discriminate and find ways of measuring that. And of course, the accessibility of data. Some data are much more accessible than others. There's this huge problem of publication bias, where interesting, big effects tend to be published far more than non-significant things, and that's a difficult problem to deal with if we're to take into account all of the evidence that's available. So, to provide an organized evidence base, I would argue that we need a collaborative evidence synthesis mechanism, one that involves all of the actors in policy, and the stakeholders and the scientists, in an effort to synthesize evidence on those questions that are most important to the policy community and indeed to wider society. And this mechanism needs to maximize transparency in how the process is conducted and to minimize those biases which are so tricky and challenging. And so we need to create a more open and sharing culture in trying to sort out this problem. And I'm arguing that systematic review is the main methodology, not the only methodology, before people jump down my throat. It's not the only methodology that can do this, but it is the primary methodology for certain sorts of questions which challenge us. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Systematic review, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a particular methodology which collates and critically appraises and synthesizes evidence. And it attempts to get all the available evidence, and it has predefined methods which minimize bias and hopefully maximize power in the way in which the evidence is synthesized. And within other sectors, it is heavily used as the methodology to provide reliable findings to inform decision-making. The major use is in looking at cause and effect relationships. So within conservation, these would probably most commonly be the impacts of the things that we do on the natural world. So looking at what effect some of the things we do, like putting up wind farms, for example, what effect it might have on bat populations, or evidence of effectiveness of the interventions that we undertake, that we spend money on as conservation organizations to try and get outcomes that we desire. And it looks at things like the size of the effect and what works where and when. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about for the use of systematic review. So this is the most important slide in my whole talk, and thanks very much to Lynn Dix and colleagues for making me think in this way. They published a paper in Tree in 2014 about evidence organization and provided a nice evidence hierarchy. This is there are lots of very, very similar evidence hierarchies. This is the one I've chosen to use. It's not quite the same, but it does illustrate the same kind of principle. But what we're trying to do is organize evidence so that it provides less uncertainty, less bias, and therefore more evidence-informed decisions. And for any one decision maker, you imagine that you face a decision in the environmental sector, you're almost certain to have, at the moment, to have to go down to primary studies. You've got to seek out the primary studies in order to help you make your decision. Okay, and that's a very difficult thing to do. You probably haven't got time to do it, you haven't got the resources or the access to the data, and you might find a few selected studies, not because you purposely intend to do that necessarily, but because that's the only thing you can do. You're likely to end up with a large amount of uncertainty because these studies might say many different things. It's very susceptible to bias, and you're likely to make a decision that's not very evidence-informed. That's not your fault, it's just the way we've organized evidence at the moment. What we've just heard about is the idea of collating, configuring evidence in synopses and systematic maps, where at least it makes it easier to get hold of the evidence, but it's still not synthesized in a way that gives you an overall balance of the evidence in terms of effect. Systematic reviews lie right at the center of evidence organization. They provide that step that takes you from all of the disorganized primary studies into an organized evidence base that then allows you to do lots of other exciting things like build models and decision support systems that are based on all of the available evidence, not a biased subset of it. What we want to do, therefore, is use systematic review to move from this relatively disorganized state into a much more organized state so that decision makers can actually, when they're looking for the answer to their question, when they're trying to make a decision, only have to go down this far. And they really don't have to go down to this lot. They don't have to take any notice of what's happening in terms of primary research directly. They just need to go down here, or hopefully even higher up. In the health services, they have something like 8,000 systematic reviews as decision makers to rely on. And I know that in the public health services, which I've been working with, they very rarely, when they're asked a question, even within a timescale of about a week from the policy community, you know, they don't have to go down here. They almost always just have to go here and look at systematic reviews, and in fact combine more than one systematic review in order to help the policy community make their decision. We have about 80 systematic reviews in the whole environmental sector. That's 2 orders of magnitude less than the health services. We really won't get anywhere in evidence organization, in my view, unless we have much more investment in undertaking systematic reviews. So how does this systematic review process proceed? I'll just go through this very quickly. There are a number of actors. There's a review team, a group that conducts the review, of course. There are commissioners, which may be the policy community, those that want the answer to the question and may be prepared to pay for it. Then there's the stakeholder group, the group that is involved and can be affected by the outcome of the review, therefore needs to be consulted about it, or else they're just going to reject it. And then there is this independent structure, which has been developed within other sectors, which provides the independence from vested interest when the review is actually conducted. So it's not done in isolation, it's done in a very transparent and open way. And within the health services, of course, we've got the Cochrane collaboration, which registers the review, quality assures the process, and helps the authors to publish the findings. And so that independent body within the environmental sector is the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. It links across to the Cochrane collaboration and to the Campbell collaboration in the social sciences. And it was constituted in 2008 as a charity. It provides guidelines and standards in how to do systematic reviews. It publishes and it registers reviews that are underway, and it has its own website and journal in order to do that. And it works with commissioners, the policy community, in order to understand what their evidence needs are and the priorities for systematic review. It has 6 centers globally, and of course it has a governance structure of trustees, of which I'm one, because it's a not-for-profit charity, a UK-registered charity. And it provides these standards so that people can both understand how to do a systematic review and also do one to a sufficient quality that it gets the CE brand. So it's branded as CE systematic review. There are things published which call themselves systematic reviews, which are not systematic reviews. That happens in health as well as in the environmental sector. They may be good, they may not be, but you know that a CE systematic review has followed a particular set of guidelines and gone through a particular process. And it's a demand-driven process. It's the process we want to see. It's not always perfect at the moment, but this is a model of how it works. So this first phase is the planning phase, when the commissioners themselves set the question. It's usually quite a specific question. It's not the review team that sets the question generally. It's in consultation with stakeholders. defines the question, the theory of change that that question relates to, and the allocation of resources. And then the process is taken away from the commissioners, the people who have a vested interest in the answer to the question. It's taken away from them and conducted by a review team under a CE protocol and reported without any influence from the actual commissioners who might have that vested interest in what comes out of it. And then, of course, it's handed back to the commissioners, and you can do lots of nice dissemination and communication activities. So it's not the information deficit model. It's not a bunch of scientists just chucking information at the policy community and expecting them to absorb it. It is started off in theory by the policy community itself, because the policy community wants that question to be answered. So very few, I've got about 3 minutes left, thanks. But so a very few case studies that illustrate the kinds of things that systematic reviews do and the kinds of findings that you can get. Here's one of the most common things. Really, systematic reviews are used to set the baseline of what we know currently about a particular issue. So greenhouse gas emissions from different forms of land management. A couple of systematic reviews have been done on this and have provided information on the comparative greenhouse gas emissions from different land management interventions, and therefore we can be much more predictive now about what's going to happen if we undertake different forms of land management. Systematic review is always work in progress, responding to one of the questions that was put out before. They should be frequently updated, and the database, new studies can be added to them. This is a lovely theory of change produced by our Swedish center, this systematic review, about the effect of reducing planktivorous and benthivorous fish on water quality. It goes from right to left, and it shows that if you, the idea is that you reduce the zooplankton feeding fish, that allows the zooplankton to increase, and it keeps the planktonic algae, which causes the blooms, in check. And the systematic review actually showed that that does work. That does work, and so let's invest some money in that, because that works almost everywhere that we've looked at studies on this subject. So it's nice when systematic reviews actually confirm that the idea, the theory of change, actually does work, and we should go on investing our money. Thanks. On the other hand, you can get examples of what we call mythbusters. Bill mentioned this very briefly yesterday, the idea that in-stream devices increase salmonid populations. Here, the systematic review showed actually evidence that it does not work. So that's evidence of no effect, which is quite unusual. But it does mean that we should be questioning any investment in that kind of intervention. Comparative effectiveness can be looked at as well. This study looked at the comparative effects of partial protection and full protection in marine protected areas. I think this has been used already in Wales. I know in the Cardigan Bay example of looking at whether partial or full protection should be given to marine protected area. Effectiveness of community forest management was, we were asked to do this by the Global Environment Facility because they spend $6 billion or so over the last decade on this kind of thing, and we found no evidence of effect. So that is not the same as the salmon situation. Here we just don't have the evidence to say that community forest management, that investment actually brings the outcomes that the Global Environment Facility wanted. And that's a big problem, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. In fact, we know that it does work in some circumstances. We just have to have a much better evidence base to demonstrate that that money is being used wisely. And we've heard a little bit about social science and natural science. This is an example of a review. It's an impact review where we've combined qualitative and quantitative evidence. 2 teams did this, actually. One team of social scientists and one team of natural scientists, and we got together at the end, and we're able to combine the qualitative and quantitative evidence to show that there are lots of impacts of protected areas on human well-being, but in fact, we've got very little evidence, quantitative evidence, to know how big or small those impacts are. So, right, just to finish off, stop. Right. 2 more slides. Just to show, this is just the point that these theories of change that conservation organizations are increasingly using, you know, lots of different steps along a causal chain or network, are things that we're now targeting, because systematic reviews are often thought of as reductionist. They only show one sort of cause and effect in a much more complex world. And that's right, that's true, it's a good limitation of systematic reviews, but they can be put together in sets that are defined by theories of change, and that's what we want to do in CE now, not just do individual reviews, but do sets of reviews, thematic programs that actually target theories of change that conservation organizations are concerned about. So that is very much the way forward, I think, with systematic reviews. And I want to end on a touch of reality, of course, that evidence is not always greeted with open arms, so however effective systematic reviews might be in producing synthesized evidence, it doesn't mean to say that they are going to be taken up by policy, and we need other mechanisms. Systematic reviews themselves are not ways of providing evidence to policy. Something needs to be done after the systematic review to communicate the evidence to policymakers. But there are carrots and sticks. So if the synthesized evidence, the organized evidence, is the carrot, it's something that policymakers can use and consume for their own purposes and use usefully. The stick is that that evidence is there and is transparent and is usable and is much more easily usable than before. And there are a number of pressure groups like Sense About Science and Alliance for Useful Evidence that are now asking questions about the policy community and of the policy community and saying, well, you've made this decision, but show us how you have used the evidence. The evidence is there. You may have gone against the evidence. There may be good reasons for that. But show us what those reasons are, because the evidence is out there. So there are carrots and sticks for the policy community in having an organized evidence base, which I think will change the dynamic of the science policy interface in quite an interesting way in the future. So, thank you very much for your time. Please engage with CE. It's an open collaboration where lots of people are contributing to systematic reviews. Please get involved. If you're interested in evidence synthesis, please talk to me later. And thank you to everybody who has contributed in the past. Sorry.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. I'll take one quick question. So right at the back, hand shot up. So wins the question.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. My question is about if you have made a systematic review on the use of systematic reviews. Oh. So basically, do you have evidence that evidence matters for policy making?
That evidence matters for policy making, that's different. Yes, well, it would be totally improper for me to do a systematic review of the effectiveness of systematic reviews. But other people are doing it, and it has been done in the health sector. And yes, systematic reviews do change policy decisions in some particular circumstances. But you've asked a specific question about the use of systematic reviews, a specific outcome of it, which I don't think has been done. What was the...
So basically, we are talking very much about evidence-based policy. We need to collect evidence to improve policy making. But do we have evidence that collecting evidence actually works?
Yes, we do. We do have a lot of good evidence that collecting evidence works, but not in the environmental sector because we haven't done it for long enough. But in the medical sector, I can take another 20 minutes or 20 hours telling you about the way in which collection of evidence has changed policy for the good and saved thousands of lives because the right intervention has been used rather than a range of other interventions which are ineffective. Yeah, it does work.
Good. Okay. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, both speakers. It's now the break, and this is your last chance to sign up for workshop.